This morning. My name is Christopher Burrell. I'm an associate professor of history here at Ostos and a member of the conference planning committee for this Ostos Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Incubator Project titled College, including the Division of Continuing Education, Office of Institutional Advancement, and the Center for Teaching and Learning. We would also like to thank the Ostos Communications Office, CUNY Start Math Start, the College Now program, the Office of Public Safety, our student volunteers, and the buildings and grounds staff for all their help in making sure today's event will be successful. Now I would like to bring up Ostos's Dean of Academic Affairs and Institutional Effectiveness, Research and Assessment, Babette Audant, to offer words of welcome.
Good morning. I'm short. So if it's okay if I stand over here, I don't know if that was amplified. Good morning. I'm thrilled to offer greetings on behalf of the provost. I'm going to make a parenthetical here. I'm also thrilled to offer greetings on behalf of the Office of Academic Affairs more generally, and I want to give a shout out to Representative Jacinta Patrice George for participating as a core member in the planning. It's wonderful to see the fruits of this work. As I said, I'm delivering greetings on behalf of Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Shankwei Wang, and welcome my fellow CUNY colleagues, our faculty, our staff, and our students to this Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conference today. Today we're addressing a pressing issue, anti-Blackness within academia, and particularly at Hispanic-serving institutions. Today's meeting addresses something that has both historical roots, long-standing historical roots, as well as, unfortunately, resounding relevance today. The work that we're doing today is crucial. It's not just a discussion, it's an opportunity to build community, make active definitions, create common ground, foundations for further conversations, and most importantly, for action. And I thank you all for being here to take part in that. You're setting the stage for a different form of listening, a different framework for listening that this institution needs to be made ready for. Frankly, those are not although I don't think she would disagree with me. I'm excited to welcome our keynote speaker, Jasmine Haywood. Thank you so much for being here today. Her wisdom and passion for student success and her experiences at four-year colleges will certainly resound with us at a two-year college, where we well know we're the ones who are preparing our students for success at four-year colleges. More than 50% of those four-year graduates across CUNY have their start at community colleges. We can never underestimate the importance of the preparation here at Hostos. A big shout out to the DEI incubator team, and special thanks to Delis Perez Cabezas for bringing us this conference today. By day's end, I hope that we leave here all motivated to take the next steps, to continue insisting that your voices be heard, that this framework be a part of our conversations at Hostos and beyond, and that for those of you from other CUNY campuses, take the good work today and continue the work and build on towards tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dean Audant, for those kind words of welcome and support. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Jasmine Haywood. She is Strategy Director at the Lumina Foundation, an independent private foundation committed to making opportunities for post-secondary education available to everyone. As a strategy director, she has assembled a portfolio of work that focuses on increasing student success at four-year institutions. Dr. Haywood has a broad academic background, including having been a visiting faculty member in the Department of Educational Leadership at Indiana State University, the managing editor of the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, a research assistant at Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis, in their Center for Urban and Multicultural Education, as well as having been an admissions counselor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. Dr. Haywood has published peer-reviewed scholarship that unveils how Afro-Latinx college students experience anti-Black Latino racism. Her doctoral dissertation, titled Triple Consciousness, focused on the racialized experience of Afro-Latinx collegians. She has been featured in various media outlets as an expert on anti-Black Latino racism, including NBC, Univision, The Atlantic, Vox, and more. Dr. Haywood was also a 2016 Ebony Magazine Power 100 honoree. And so without further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. Jasmine Haywood.
Okay. A little mood lighting.
Yeah. I don't take the whole setup.
All right, let's see. Oh, where did it go? I can do it. I don't know how I closed it. Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
How's everyone doing?
Good.
Good. Okay, this is gonna be a conversation. I'm just gonna let you know up front. I've been up since 3:30. My flight.
I don't know why that's happening.
I didn't touch anything.
No,
I'll stand by it. It just keeps disappearing.
It's a very sensitive machine.
Okay. Well, the computer needs some coffee.
Yeah.
Let's try again. It's Chris's fault.
Yeah, that's right.
PowerPoint is not.
Okay, while we're figuring that out, in the interest of time, I will get started. So I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit about myself, who I am, where I'm from, how I got here. But before I do that, would love to hear a little bit about who's in the room this morning. So interested in the kind of the mix of backgrounds and people you have here. So if you are a CUNY student, raise your hand. How many students, undergrad? If you're staff, raise your hand at any point. And if you are faculty or have a faculty line, oh, good, okay. So I want to share a little bit about myself. That's me and my father a long time ago. I probably can't get on his shoulders anymore. So I, in a lot of ways, just coming back to New York is home for me. I live in Indianapolis right now. I was born and raised in upstate New York. My father was born and raised in the Bronx, and my mother was born and raised in El Barrio, not too far as well. My aunt actually was the first in our family to get a post-secondary degree from this institution.
Yeah.
It's really special for me to be here, and I was excited to tell her that I would be here this morning. I asked her if she wanted to come, and she said, "No, honey, I'll see you after." She was not interested. So she's retired, and she said, "At what time?" No, I'll see you. So that part makes it special for me. You know, coming. For me, summer camp was coming down to the projects where my grandmother lived on 108th and Washington every summer. And so I have very fond memories in Manhattan and New York. My mother also went to high school just a few blocks away at St. Pius, which is no longer in existence, but used to be a high school back in Florida. So thank you for having me. Thank you to the DI Incubator. Thank you to the conference planning team. And thank you to CUNY as well. I'm happy to be here. So like I said, I grew up in upstate New York, Albany. There at the time, 80s, 90s, it's a little bit different now, but the Puerto Rican and Dominican population at the time was rapidly growing. And so, you know, I grew up around people that looked like me. I knew who I was, right? I knew where my family came from. And went to college in upstate New York. So spent, you know, most of my life here. And then for graduate school, decided that New York was too small. So after undergrad, I moved down to the city and worked for a little bit, and then ended up going to Indianapolis at Indiana University for my master's. And so that was a big shift. You know, I really took for granted the diversity that exists here and just the awareness of the diversity that exists in New York City, in the state of New York. And so while I really welcomed and wanted a change to a different part of the country, it was quite the transition. And still I've been in Indianapolis for 15 years. I know I look like 15, but I've been there for 15 years. And you know, still I feel most days that I am not from there, because oftentimes people will say, "Where are you from?" Like, you know, you talk different, you act different, you must not come here. And so I want to share a little story about a few things that happened to me my first few years in the state of Indiana. That really was a reckoning for me in terms of my cultural, ethnic, racial identity. So this was the second and final year of my master's program, and I had never been to Division I homecoming football tailgate, because the school that I went to in New York just didn't have those things. And so I was like, you know, I gotta see if this is like the movies that, you know, I have to check it out once. So I went to, it is like the movies, by the way. I went to, you know, D1 homecoming tailgate, had a blast. Afterwards, my friend and I, who's also Afro-Caribbean, we were walking to our car. And we walked by a group of white undergraduate boys on their porch playing beer pong. Again, just like the movies. And as we were walking by, they shouted out racial slurs to us. I'm not going to say what they said, but they shouted out racial slurs to us. And I had experienced racism before, but I had never been explicitly called a racial slur in the city to my face. I don't know, maybe behind my back. And so that moment for me was a little bit of a reckoning for a few reasons. So just the explicit, like in your face racism, I was like, oh, this is different. And then also the particular racial slur they called us, right, was like rooted in them perceiving us as being Black. And so, like I told you, I grew up in a predominantly Dominican and Puerto Rican community. My family was very stern on, this is your culture, this is who you are. But they tiptoed around Blackness. It was never, hey, when you go out into the world, they're going to see you as Black. There were no conversations like that. Or it was always, you're Puerto Rican first. Both my parents are Puerto Rican. You're Puerto Rican first. That's who you are, period. Puerto Ricans are, you know, the rainbow people. We're a perfect, beautiful mix of these, you know, three separate groups, and none of them could do no harm, right? As a lot of you know, I see a lot of heads shaking. That, you know, growing up, conversations around Blackness were tiptoed off. They weren't explicit in my family. And so at that moment, aside from the fact that I wanted to yell things back at these boys, you know, I had a reckoning of, oh wow, okay, so they really, like, I'm Black out here and everywhere. And despite my parents and my family invisibilizing that or not making an explicit mention of that, that is how the world perceives me. And that is an important thing for me to understand, right? And so there was this kind of internal reckoning that happened for me in that moment. The other quick story I want to share is, so around the same time, I was applying to doctoral programs, and, you know, in doing that process, which the faculty in the room know, you meet with faculty in the doctoral programs to try and schmooze them and convince them why they're worthy of doing the program. And even though I had been in my master's program for 2 years, I never had a Latino professor ever. In fact, I never even met a Latino person with a PhD. And so, I mean, I had teachers, you know, in elementary school, but in undergrad and in my master's program, did not have that experience. And so one of the programs I was applying for had a prominent Latino higher education scholar in the program. And I reached out to her and I said, hey, I'm planning to apply to your program. Would love to talk about, you know, potential research topics that I'm interested in. And I remember on my way to her office, I called my father and I was like, "Wow, I'm meeting with a Latino that has a PhD." I said, "Isn't that crazy?" And he was excited for me going to the meeting. And, you know, I'm all, you know, bushy-eyed and, you know, naive. And I'm like, hey, you know, this is what I was became interested in my master's program. I'm really interested in the experiences of Afro-Latino students. There's not much research on them. Would love to fill that gap and understand more of what that experience is like and inform the field. And she looked at me and said, are you sure that's what you want to do? And I was like, yes. And she was like, I don't think that's an important research topic. And proceeded to tell me that she didn't think I would be successful as a doctoral student in the program with that interest of research. And she didn't think I would be successful because of my GRE scores. And she said, you know, I think you should think about not applying for the doctoral program. You should prefer and maybe revisit in a few years, get some more work experience. Mind you, I had work experience before I started my master's. And so and she was a white appearing Latina, right? And so I don't know for certain her response to me was rooted in her own prejudices, biases, internalized oppression. But I felt it and suspected it. And so I left that meeting, you know, I left that meeting feeling the complete opposite of how I did going into it. And, you know, it like shattered little 20-year-old Jasmine for maybe like a few hours. And then I was back. And so I applied to that doctoral program and I graduated from it. And I did do my dissertation on Afro experiences with Afro-Latino students. And ended up running into this particular professor at a conference a few years after I graduated. And she came to me and said, You know, I just want to tell you, I just updated my newest book on Latino students in higher education. And I wanted to say thank you for your scholarship on these students, because I was able to write a chapter. And she didn't invite me to write a chapter. But she didn't go that far. But she said I was able to talk about this population and their experiences because of the research and the work that you did. I don't think she remembered the conversation we had when, you know, because when you're a faculty member, I know this now, you meet with so many students and it's like, it's a book. But that moment was, you know, full circle and in a lot of ways and very telling. And so I could share more experiences with you, but those are the types of experiences that laid the foundation for my research. I'm sure many of you have similar experiences, but just wanted to share a little bit about me and how I got here. And so,
Yeah. I'm very quiet.
So we're gonna start off with, I just want to go through a few definitions. Oh, can you put it in slideshow?
It's gonna reject it. I'm fortunate spot.
Okay. Can you do it for like a minute and
Let's
then
see.
take it
Yeah.
off?
Gotcha.
This is an animated slide, so I really want you guys to see it. So I want to go through some definitions so that before we dive into a deeper conversation, we are all operating from the same set of terms, definitions, meanings. A lot of words are thrown out here and there these days, and you know, you never know. People might have different perceptions of what particular words mean.
It's not exciting. I'm gonna try one more time.
Okay. So the first, there we go. There we go. Okay, so Latinidad. Who has heard of this word or this identifier before? Okay, so some people. So Latinidad is and it's not. Latinidad is an identifier for those that are Latino, right? And it is a social construct, and it's based on a particular complex experience, right? That is intersected by all of these things here on the screen. If the animation were to work, what you will see is a lot of red marker crossing things out and revising this particular definition. I didn't memorize that part, so we can share that with you later. But what I want to share here is that the concept of Latinidad or being Latino is very high level and imposes a very monolithic view of the population, right? It's a very umbrella term that lumps together a group of people with a vast array of experiences, phenotypes, etc., into one group, essentially for convenience, right? And so when we think about this definition, it's important to look at its future with respect to its past and the present as well. And what we also need to think about is how revisionist white Latino narratives, what they want to happen is that we forget colonization and the impact colonization has had on Latino subgroups in favor of this notion of a false Latino unity, you know, that everyone is all happy-go-lucky, rainbows and butterflies under the Latino umbrella, when in fact history has told us and the present moment has told us that that has yet to come to fruition. There are small snippets in history where it's happened, but overall that Latino unity has yet to come to fruition, and that's something that we need to remember. And so what's important is thinking about a Latinidad or Latino identity that is grounded in Indigenous sovereignty, and almost more importantly, grounded in Black liberation, right? And when Latinidad is grounded in those two things, then that will be a manifestation of a Latinidad that we can all get behind. So I just wanted to break that down and revise that definition a little bit. So now we can move into anti-Black racism. You can go to the next slide. Okay. So so similar to Latinidad, we have this phrase, people of color, right? Another very high level, kind of monolithic phrase that groups together millions of different identities, right? And what we need to consider is the extent to which that centers anti-Blackness. And oftentimes it does not when you're saying people of color. And when it comes to something like racism that's rooted in power, racism can happen in a variety of different ways. So anti-Asian racism manifests differently and feels and looks and happens differently than anti-Black racism, right? And so for that reason, it's very important to name Blackness and specify anti-Black racism to acknowledge the difference in that experience that holds Black folks in oppression, okay? And so when we say anti-Blackness, that is why that specificity is really critical when referring to the Black experience. Thank you. And so here's, there's a few different definitions, but this is a definition that I really resonate with. So a system of beliefs and practices that attack, erode, and limit the humanity of Black people. And that's by Harold Peters. And so the next thing I want to talk about that is connected to racism and kind of nested underneath it is colorism. So who here is familiar with that term of colorism? Okay, most people. Good. So colorism, like I said, is connected. Colorism and racism are interlinking. They reinforce each other in a bad way, not a good way, but they reinforce each other. And colorism operates both intra-racially and intra-ethnically. Okay, so for example, myself as an Afro-Puerto Rican woman, I experience colorism within the Puerto Rican community. I also experience colorism when I'm with a monolithic Black community, or when I'm with a group of white folks, right? I experience colorism in all of those spaces, but it looks differently. It can manifest differently depending on who you're around and who it's coming from and the context. And so there's different kind of parallels that happen with colorism. And so so the last thing I'll mention about this is it also depends on phenotype. So a lighter skinned Latino identifying person likely experiences colorism differently than a darker skinned Latino person or an African descendant Latino person. And so that's just, it's important to keep in mind the nuances and the complexities. And so it's so fluid, right? Like it can change like that depending on the context, and that's not always taken into account. It's not just a one-size-fits-all experience for individuals. Okay, so what does this mean? How does this show up? How does it manifest in our communities? All right, so this is not an exhaustive list. These are the ones that I think are the most frequent but I'm sure some of you can think of lots of other ways in terms of how this shows up and manifests. So the first one is avoiding real contact with Black people. And that sounds like silly, right? Or like, how would I avoid real contact with Black people? Or why would I do such a thing? But it can be very subconscious and unintentional and rooted in your own discomfort that you may not be fully aware of. So there could be a lack of awareness of how you partake in the avoidance of Black folks, right? I know I've seen this in my own family. I've seen my grandmother do it. I've seen my mother do it. I've seen my father do it, who is in fact Black himself, right? And so that what's important to think about too is these things, these offenses or committing an act of anti-Blackness or colorism is not only relegated to those that have lighter skin or white skin, whether they're white or a white presenting Latino. People that identify as Black, as Afro-Latino, can perpetuate and engage in these things too, unfortunately. And when that happens, that's called internalized oppression, which I will get to more in a minute. So avoiding real contact with Black people. So what this can look like is failing to learn about the history and the richness of Black culture or their struggles and victories. And when I say, just caveat, when I say Black culture, that's inclusive of Afro-Latino, right? And so, you know, that avoidance is a manifestation of anti-Blackness. Voiding the value of Black people by often not seeking their opinions and expertise. Has anyone ever been in a meeting where there's a conversation around, you know, the student success of Black students, or, you know, the Black student organization, or, you know, insert whatever Black student initiative, but there is not one Black person in the room. And it's like, you know, so you could invite them into the conversation. It's like, well, we want to do work to benefit Black students, but not actually ask them about their expertise and their experience in their own lived experiences, right? And that happens way too often in higher education. And it's a problem. And it happens within the Latino community as well. Oftentimes, Afro-Latino faculty, staff, or students, or Black faculty, staff, or students will be invited into a conversation or invited to be a token in a way that's convenient for white folks, but not when it's time to actually inform the importance of the work. And that's something that we need to think about and realize. Number 3 is probably one of the most common in terms of how anti-Blackness manifests itself. So referring to particular ethnic or racial features as less desirable, right? So I'm sure a lot of you in here are familiar, you know, with the idea of pelo malo, pelo bueno, right? And just that conversation around hair, and particularly as a Latina or Afro-Latina growing up, you know all too well the conversations and trauma, frankly, that comes along with that. And again, this can show up subconsciously, and where people are not aware of it. And it can show up, again, this is where you see the intersection with colorism. It can show up as not a bad thing. So the example I'll give is when my son was born, he's probably a shade, 2 shades darker than me. My husband's Trinidadian. And my parents were so obsessed with his skin color. They were like, oh, his skin is so beautiful. oh, so there was this over infatuation, right, with his skin color. Like, oh, it's so perfect. How did he end up like this? And I'm like, Mom, do we really need to go there? Right. So there's this, and particularly for Afro-Latino women, and speaking from experience, there can be a hypersexualization that happens, both within the Latino community, within the Black community, and within the white community. I've experienced both. And so, on its surface, that may not seem like oh, what's wrong with you? They're giving your son a compliment. Like, take the compliment and be quiet. But that's rooted in anti-Blackness, right? And oftentimes what happens is they like your Black skin, but they don't like everything else that comes with it, right? And so if you're gonna like what's on the surface, then you need to educate yourself and have a full appreciation for everything that comes along with it. And that is not often done within the Latino community. And I, again, from experience, this is hard to call out within friendship circles, within your families. When you see it happen, it can be subtle. I used to, when I stopped straightening my hair, I got comments for a good 5 years from my family members about when was I going to straighten my hair again, and, at some point you get comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? And, it's like, oh, okay, Kiki, well, why does something bother you about my hair not being straight? Like, what's the problem? Right? And so again, all of that is rooted in that legacy of colonization, Spanish colonization, and the trauma our ancestors faced in terms of surviving in a very white supremacist world. So 4, over questioning the direction, work, and style of Black leaders. This is a cornerstone of higher education, unfortunately, where there was this incessant questioning about the expertise of Afro-Latino people or Black people. Doesn't matter how many credentials they have. It doesn't matter if they have those 3, PhD letters after their names. And sometimes even if their counterparts have less training or less academic credentials, there's still a question that happens. And so we just need to keep in mind how that shows up, who it's coming from, and how we can engage in a conversation to dismantle those things. And then the last thing I'll say is just silence, right? And we all know that phrase, silence is violence, right? But your decision to not engage or to remain silent on these things, if you bear witness to them, that means you're perpetuating it. That does not absolve you from partaking. That does not deem you innocent. Your silence makes you complicit in the perpetuation of the anti-Blackness that occurs on the daily basis. Okay, so student affairs. So I'm happy to hear that there's a lot of staff in the room. So this is for you guys. So you might be saying like, okay, so what? How can I see how this shows up in my work? So the main thing is data collection, and honestly, this has implications for more than just student affairs, for more than education. This is an issue in social work, in health equity, any field, you name it. The census, it's been a huge controversy in the census. They can't figure out how to categorize us, right? And so, typically you'll see those high level categories: Black, white, Hispanic, Native American. What this does, though, aside from the fact that Hispanic is an imposed federally created term, but what this does is it doesn't, again, like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't provide nuance to the experiences, to who's in the data. One of the things that I wrote about in one of my articles when I was a faculty member is I did a review of every single article that was written about Latino students in college, in higher education. And and this was at the time I was a grad student, I don't know what it is now, but at the time when I was a doctoral student, none of those articles within the subfield of higher education disaggregated any further than Latino, right? And so every time I read them, I was like, well, what about, the experiences of like the Dominicans in the sample, or the Puerto Ricans, or the Panamanians? Like, perhaps their experiences were slightly different than their white presenting counterparts, and we don't have that nuance to understand that, or to even say that that's a thing. And so what I present in my research is just that there's a lack of disaggregation of Latino student data, and so that invisibilizes tons of student experiences, right? Like we're not able to say anything about that. So there's more research out there now, obviously, but we're not able to say much if we just stop at collecting data on Latino students. And this can be applicable in a student affairs setting as well, right? So for a lot of events, like this one, or other co-curricular events, oftentimes you have people sign in, or you have people swipe their student IDs, right? It would be helpful if you had people provide, the option to give their racial and ethnic identity in the way that they identify, and then disaggregating by that to see if there's a difference in experiences by race and ethnicity. Oftentimes there is, right? And so that only informs your work, makes it better, and it's something where there's a lot of room for improvement. The second thing that I want to talk about is curriculum and programming. And so within the academic curriculum, right, we have Black studies, we have Latino studies. When you think about ethnic studies, oftentimes those two things are separate, right? As if they're mutually exclusive, and there can't possibly be any history in the world that is at the intersection of Black studies and Latino studies, right? There's lots of them. And so that's how that shows up in the curriculum. There's other ways, but that's one example of how that shows up. I'd say over the past decade, there has increasingly been more programs that do acknowledge this and that center on this. FIU, for example, in Florida, has a program on Afro-Latino studies. Amherst College has several courses on it as well. And Dartmouth has some postdoc and faculty lines that specifically focus on Afro-Latinidad. You guys are kind of spoiled here in the city. I mean, you've got the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, you've got the Dominican Studies Center, right? And so, and I know both of them, they do it more, but they do, and they have acknowledged that, the presence of Blackness in our communities. Outside the state of New York, that doesn't happen much. So take advantage. So that's how that shows up. And then I'll say quickly on programming, when we think about things like Black Student Center or Latino Student Center, programming, oftentimes they're very segmented in the same way that it shows up in the curriculum, where it's like, oh, here's our academic supports and co-curricular supports for Latino students and for Black students, right? And not thinking about how those groups might have overlap. Similarly, shows up in fraternity and sorority life, where it can feel and be very segregated in terms of the racial and ethnic makeup of fraternities and sororities. And then cultural centers. I'll touch on that one a little bit more because I'm going to provide some data on the cultural centers. So now I want to share some quotes from some of the research that I conducted several years ago in a previous life, before I was at Lumen Foundation, I was a faculty member. I'm going to share 3 examples. This one's a positive example from a participant in my research study. She's Afro-Panamanian. I actually invited her today. She lives not too far in the Heights, but she wasn't able to make it. So she was sharing that at the particular institution where she went for undergrad, she was pleasantly surprised when they acknowledged that Panama Canal turned 100, and they brought a Panamanian group wearing traditional clothing to do Panamanian dance, and they had food. And she was shocked, and she said, "Oh my gosh, my school did something right." And for context, she went to undergrad in California, where there's even less Panamanians, and so she was just really surprised that there was even an acknowledgement of her culture on campus. Okay, so I started off with the good. So here's so I mentioned how this shows up in the curriculum. And so one person that I interviewed talked about how she was looking for a major, trying to settle on something. She knew she wanted to do something related to her own personal history and culture. But all of the courses in what her institution called the Latin American Studies Department were very grounded in the history of only Mexico. And so to her, she used the word exhausting, but she also went on to talk about how there was no display of the diversity that exists within the Latino umbrella, and she decided in the end not to major in that. So that's another example, and then I have one last one. This is where I got actually a title for an article that I wrote, and this is a Afro-Dominicana student that talked about how in her undergraduate experience, she went to school in Massachusetts, how in her experience, she always felt uncomfortable in predominantly Latino spaces. She was just always made to feel personally like she stuck out, or like she didn't feel comfortable in those spaces. She provided some other examples, but this quote is telling, and she says, those spaces had always been the most violent for her. And where she felt most comfortable, where she sought refuge, where she felt most at home, was in Black spaces. She majored in Africana studies and had the benefit and privilege of having a lot of Black female faculty members support her in getting her college degree. Okay, so then now what? So I never like to talk to people or give speeches and then I'm like, okay, anti-Blackness, and I'm out. Like good luck with that. So I always like to engage in a conversation about like, well, what do we do with this, so that folks don't leave feeling, undefeated and defeated and paralyzed. And so, what does all this mean, and how can we collectively move forward with this? You can go ahead. So I want to talk about how do we engage in dismantling. So the first step is, and sorry, this is hard to read. The first step is understanding, right? So step one, you are all here today to understand. You can check that box. Give yourself a pat on the back. You are engaging in an attempt to understand. And so, it's experiences like this where you put yourself in spaces to learn and to grow and to understand the experiences of other people, right? So that you can do better. And then that phrase, right? When you know better, you do better. Thank you, Chris. So after that, we have confront. So I talked earlier about internalized oppression, right, and how that can show up. And so once you are aware of and recognize internalized oppression, then it's your choice of like, what do you do with it? Are you going to sit in the corner and say, woe is me, I'm oppressed, oh my God? right? Or are you going to like confront that and figure out what you're going to do with, I mean, that might be you get some therapy, right? Because it might have been 2-3 decades of internal, it might have been your whole life and you just didn't realize it, right? And so that's an important thing to figure out how to heal from. And frankly, that's what needs to happen is that healing and working through that. And I'll say it's not a one and done thing. You will never arrive at, I never ever experienced internalized depression for the rest of my life. It's a thing you have to keep pushing back on, right? Because the society that we live in is rooted and based in white supremacy. And so in tackling anti-Blackness, as a minoritized person, whether you're Black, Latino, you must recognize and challenge a deeply held urge to pick a fight for justice for your own particular group of people against the fight for justice for Black people. And so what happens oftentimes, particularly between communities of color, is this oppression Olympics, of like, our people went through more stuff than your people did, so, don't come over here with that, and instead of, how can we work together? And I'm not free till you're free. And, thinking about how are the oppressions, although we may experience them differently, how are they interlocked and intertwined, and what can we do collectively to dismantle that? And so pushing back against that feeling of only one of us can win justice and liberation at a time, if ever, and thinking about it more so as we collectively can win it together if we work together. Calling out. So I already described some of the ways that it, just checking time. I already described some of the ways that it manifests, but it's also important to call it out, which I spoke about earlier. And in doing that, it's becoming comfortable with the uncomfortable. Some of you, as you've heard some of the definitions and experiences, you might be a little bit sweaty and your heart's racing, and you might feel a little uncomfortable. But I encourage you to just think about, why do I feel this way, and where is that coming from, and really exploring why that feeling might be coming up for you. Collect. So I mentioned this with the point on data. So making sure you're collecting data. Part of the issue in terms of why we can't fight for justice for Afro-Latino folks in the US is because we don't have any data on them. And so to the extent possible where you're able to advocate for this, and this is important in both small and big ways, will be really helpful. Centering their voices, and then showing up and doing the work. And I will say, white presenting Latino people are actually uniquely positioned to dismantle anti-Blackness, as long as you're not showing up as like a white savior. You got to do your own work first. But there is a place, and there's a way to use the privilege that you have in such a way that the collective benefits from it. So that's important to keep in mind. Slide. So I want to end with talking about this idea of intersectional oppression. How many people have heard of that phrase before? Okay. So intersectional oppression is the premise for this idea can be that people experience both privilege and oppression simultaneously. So again, you might be feeling uncomfortable hearing some of these things because you're like, but no, I'm still Latino, or I'm still, insert marginalized identity. I experience oppression. Yes, that's valid, you do. But there's also ways that you're privileged, that we are multidimensional people, right? For example, I experience oppression because of my racial and ethnic identities as Black and Puerto Rican, but I'm able-bodied. I have 2 functional legs and arms. I can walk and move in this world. I don't have any disabilities. right? So I'm privileged when it comes to my own physical ability. And there's ways that I can and have used that to advocate for people that may not be, right? And so two truths can exist within your own personal experience. The other thing to think about is what can happen as a result of intersectional oppression is other minoritized or marginalized groups in their effort to achieve equity, justice, liberation, they may assert or compare themselves to Black folks and say, we're not like them. And that's a problem. In fact, the island of Puerto Rico did it for a few decades when they were courting the United States to be part of the United States. They engaged in massive acts, so did the Dominican Republic, massive acts of anti-Blackness to distance themselves specifically from Black people. And so that we need to think about how those intersections show up and play out. And so I'm going to end with a quick little illustration. So this is Bob. Everyone say hi, Bob.
Hi.
Okay, Bob was born as a blue stripy triangle. Okay, he loves his stripes. He loves his triangular shape, and he's very proud of who he is. Okay, but some people don't like his triangularness. I don't know if that's a word, or his stripes. You know, they're not down with the striped triangle. And luckily, there's groups for triangles. There's groups for stripes. Bob tries to engage in that, but those two groups don't work together. They don't like each other. So Bob is often made to feel like he has to choose between, and he doesn't feel comfortable in either, right? And so he wishes that maybe they could work together a little bit better. Right, and so this is exactly the illustration and premise of intersectionality, right? The belief that oppressions are interlinked and they can't be solved alone. Different dimensions of oppression are not isolated. They don't happen separately. I don't experience oppression as a Black woman, as a Puerto Rican woman, and as a woman all separately. Oftentimes, I have the lovely joy of experiencing all three at the same time, where I'm fielding the sexism, the anti-Blackness, and the colorism at the same time, right? And sometimes you can't tell which is which, right? And that's a lot of fun. And so it's all interlinked, right? And so the point is, the only way you can dismantle this and have success in fighting back against this is acknowledging that, dismantling that, and collectively working together and acknowledging how my liberation and justice for me is intimately interlocked and interlinked with the liberation and justice of those around you that are also marginalized. So I'm going to stop talking and would love to engage in a conversation or questions and any feedback from you all.
Any questions in the audience? Or any comments?
I was thinking as you were talking, especially about collective data, one of the categories that I always found so incredible was Black, not Hispanic. And so I would put a line through the not. That was sort of like my resistance. And the separation of those things is something that we're still obviously plagued by. So
Yeah.
just a thought I wanted to share.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about curriculum because going through education, higher education, first of all, you don't get exposed to, you know, African seniors in elementary, in high school. We get taught about slavery, enslaved folks. But there's, you know, a whole podcast of enslaved folks. They're not just American. So then when I took a class in college and we were talking about the history of Latin America, here we go again, it's about colonialism, it's about Europeans, and these other folks were the enslaved. But very little is talked about. We hear a lot about the Native Americans, the indigenous people, you know, and then like a little paragraph or two about enslaved folks. So, you know, being a person that you're hoping to see representation, even in Latin American history texts, it's so absent. It is kind of like glossed over. And, you know, for lack of a better example, when you take actually American history, learn about people that fought oppression and people that resisted. If you don't have that history in Latin American texts about the Black enslaved folks that fought resistance and fought slavery, you don't see that heroic representation. You see them as marginalized. And I think it's symbolic of how Afro-Latinos are presented. That they are marginalized, that they're invisible, that they have not resisted, that they have not fought. And it's sad because, you know, now that I'm educated in the South and I'm reading about so many Black Latinos that resisted and that, you know, in Brazil, they went to the mountains and they fought in Panama as well. So it's just, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yeah, the Afro-Latino reader attempt was probably like the first thing that laid the groundwork for that. It was a very small publication. There's a few universities that do focus on it. UT Austin is one of them. But yes, to your point, there's so much more to be done, more research to share, cover.
So, thank you so much for enlightening us and sharing your research and your experience. I'm Ana Osuna, I'm Black Studies coordinator, and my original line was in Latino Studies and also Black Studies. So I still intersect, the two fields of study. Just to piggyback on your comment about curriculum, I just think it's all out there, right? In the last 10 years, there's just been a slew of indigenous scholarship that exists. Like I think La Decana, Ana Garcia Reyes, and we've done work with the ESI. They developed a comprehensive website called First Black, and it centers Black resistance, not just the enslavement, which I used to share my homework. That's, you can talk to me about that. But the center Black resistance and rebellion, right? From talking about free Blacks that came to the Americas, even women that were in the Iberian Peninsula and decided to come with their children, right? An enslaved woman who poisons her enslaver, right? So these are all, and I'm just thinking the aside right now because of the Afro-Latinx context. I think that's the most important. But of course, like when you look at just within the realm of anti-racism, right? The work of Ibram Kendi has been very central. And I think that it just takes us, right, as for me, as an Afro-Dominicana and Black Studies professor, just to intersect, bring those works together, like you brought in Kimberly Crenshaw, like you can't talk about anti-Blackness without talking about intersectionality, right? It's all together because of our identity. These oppressions, they do intersect. So just thank you so much for bringing all of that. And we do have a lot of work to do because it's that bringing together. The scholarship is there. It's just the bringing it into the classroom.
Yep, totally agree.
participating right now at Indiana University, and I did a scoping review of all the studies in the United States of Latinas in sexual pleasure and sexual satisfaction. 0 of them were free. I was looking at them in a hundred. And I did the through 2022. So maybe this year things will come out. I haven't published yet, so probably not. But we will, because I'm publishing. But it is incredible. Like, I literally just looked at 1990 to 2022, and there was nothing that recognized it, despite the fact that there's plenty of blogs, memes, like people talk about this, right? But it's not reaching because people don't consider it important enough. And I'm so grateful for all the Black sexologists I'm in community with that are doing this work, but I really want to see, and there are folks who will look at like Afro-Latin experiences, but I do want to see us talking about the way that this affects people differently, the way people identify differently. And I wanted to ask, because I try and look at street race, right? Like, what is it that people are going to perceive you as in our community? Anti-Blackness means people don't recognize their Blackness sometimes. It also means white people won't recognize, white Latinas won't recognize their whiteness. I'm Latino, and it's like, you're also white, because that's how the world's reading you. And so I wonder if you have suggestions for folks who are collecting data on how do we do this. Like, street race is one example. Is there other ways that we do it so we're capturing those experiences when people tend to shy away from race because they don't want to talk about it?
Yeah, there's some examples of that in K-12 research where, because I anticipated that for my research, but what ended up happening was all my research participants self-identified as Afro-Latino or Afro-Dominican. But in the K-12 research, there's studies where they ask participants, how do they identify? And then they ask participants, how would other people identify you? To see if they are the same or not. And then there's a few research studies where they use actual pictures. And they'll say, like, here's a picture with different phenotypes, skin colors of Latinos, and they'll say, pick the one that is most similar to you. So they don't use the pictures of the actual participants, but they ask them to choose someone that is reflective of their own phenotype. And so one that like proved that internalized depression is a thing in the Latino community, but also saw and proved, and there's research on this in Latino studies too, how oftentimes the way Afro-Latinos identify and the way they're perceived on the street differs. And so I think you can also ask about, which I did in my research, you can ask about the racial and ethnic backgrounds of their parents to help inform and just paint a more holistic picture of like who they are and where they come from. But yeah, those are some of the things that come to mind. I think the answer to your question is yes. There would still be resistance and rejection if there was more of a collective fight. But that's because it scares them. Like all of us being in community with each other and organizing and catalyzing things together, that is really scary for a system of white supremacy, a system of power. And when I say white supremacy, I'm not talking about people, I'm talking about a system. And so, yeah, there's going to be resistance regardless. But I mean, because I work in the state policy, federal policy space now, there is, you can make a better case for things when you're all working together. And oftentimes what happens is the messenger matters. And so, you know, if we are advocating for Afro-Latino rights, oftentimes that may be, when it comes to state policy, federal policy, legislators, that might be heard better or received better from someone that is not Afro-Latino. Like that's just how it goes. Right, which is why allies and accomplices are really important. But yeah, to your point, there'd still be resistance, but I think it's still worth the collective fight and effort together. Yeah.
We have time for one more comment or question.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother speech. I gave that speech 2 weeks ago. Yes, I'll be, yeah, very brief. I can make my friend Farhad come talk about it soon. Yeah, I mean, yes, so several months ago, a lot of you saw the Supreme Court decision about around the SFFA case, and that you can no longer use race as a deciding factor for admission. And some of the work I lead at the Foundation has been centered around mitigating the chilling effects and the overcorrection that is coming with that. We are in the process of organizing general councils of universities because they are often the people that are holding the power when it comes to these decisions and the most conservative. They essentially operate to protect institutions from risk and not actually advocate for the benefit of students of color. And so, so we're convening general councils. We're also convening, senior level academic leaders, department heads, deans, to provide them with the correct interpretation of the law so that they have the confidence and the agency and the power to push back if they are told, which is happening. It's happening in the state of Indiana. If they're told they can't do something like a race-based student support program or financial aid or merit aid that is based on race, which is still legally defensible and allowable. So we're doing a lot in that space right now, but those are probably some of the top things that we're working on.
Join me once again in thanking Dr. Haywood. This session will certainly stimulate discussion for the rest of our time here today. Before we lead into the next portion of our program, which will be facilitated group discussions on experiences anti-Blackness on your campus, how they're handled, and creating the kind of campus environments that promote full respect for Black people, we would like to get your input on how we will form our discussion groups. So please use your smartphones if you